everyone. Great to see you here at Web Summit. We have got a perhaps slight change to the advertised series of events because right now we're here to talk about powering the transition to renewable energy. And in 2015, the Paris Climate Agreement laid out a number of goals for the world. One, of course, to further reduce greenhouse gas emissions and keep the global temperature rise to below 2 degrees Celsius. And EDP is one of the companies trying to meet those goals. And here on the stage to talk about how the company plans to do it is their CEO, Miguel Stilwell d'Andrade. So, Miguel, the goal set out in the climate agreement was to get to carbon neutrality by 2050, but EDP has set a different goal, hasn't it? Why was that, and what is it?
Well, good morning, everyone, and good morning, Robin. So first, I think that we truly believe that it is important to reach a net zero by 2050, and we're starting off, fortunately, from a good position. EDP is the third greenest utility in Europe already. 75% of our generation is already coming from renewable sources. And we set out a clear objective. We wanted to be coal-free by 2025, and we wanted to be all green by 2030. And that's in terms of our emissions. And then in terms of actually being carbon neutral, so all of the supply chain, we set out the goal of 2040. And we truly believe that it is important that everyone step up, that obviously governments have to put in place objectives and policies, but then the companies also need to do their work. They need to actually set out ambitious objectives, and it has to be compatible with where they're starting from. So, we are a global renewable energy company. We invest a lot in innovation. We invest a lot in wind, solar, batteries. We have a good networks business, and so we felt that actually we should be more aggressive than what are, let's say, the official public objectives, and that's why we set out those goals.
So you described one of your objectives as being all green. What does all green mean to you?
All green means that we will be producing 100% of our energy in the 29 countries that we're in with renewable energy. So we will not be emitting CO2. It means we will be out of thermal, so out of coal by 2025, and out of gas by 2030. So that, for us, is a concept of all green. So between the mix of, as I say, wind onshore, wind offshore, solar, batteries, hydrogen, all of our 10 million consumers in all the different countries that we're in, that they will be supplied with 100% renewable energy.
So EDP operates in a number of different territories, but let's focus on Portugal for a moment. What's the energy picture like here?
So Portugal is a good case study, and I think we're fortunate to have our base here and have started expanding. Currently, Portugal doesn't have any coal. It actually became coal-free as of last year. About 65% of Portugal's energy mix is renewables already. And so if you actually think about it, this year, despite the energy crisis that we're living in, the Portuguese domestic consumer only had a 1.8 increase in their energy price, the domestic consumers, and next year around 2.8%. If you think about it in the context of Europe, where there's a massive increase in energy prices for domestic consumers. And why is that? Because in Portugal, with the renewable energy that we have, it's predictable in terms of price. And so that's allowed us to, let's say, weather this energy crisis. So it used to be an overcost in the past. It's currently like an insurance against these big spikes in energy.
You say renewable energy is predictable in terms of price, but is it predictable in terms of supply? I know there was a drought on the Iberian Peninsula this summer affecting the amount of water, so the hydro generation that could be done. Is that a problem?
Well, I think hydro is definitely the most volatile of the renewable sources. Just to give you a couple of numbers, but if you want, solar would typically have a volatility of around 2 or 3% on average every year. Wind maybe 5 or 6% volatility. Hydro will be 30% plus. And this year we actually had 60% less hydro than what would be normal. So I think if you have the different mix, if we had more wind and more solar, then that also makes up. And basically when you have a more diversified mix, you end up also reducing the risk globally. I'm not saying that there won't be gas as backup, certainly for the foreseeable future, the next couple of decades. But certainly if we had more wind and solar producing, that would reduce some of the risk, for example, coming from the hydro.
So let's go back to those climate goals set in 2015. I think it's fair to say that the world has changed in many ways since then. Let's talk about the pandemic first. How did that change people's energy usage, and are those changes here to stay?
Well, the pandemic obviously had a huge impact in terms of the demand, and it didn't fundamentally necessarily change the mix per se, but I think what we have seen, though, is coming out of the pandemic and currently the energy crisis. I mean, what started off actually last year, even before the war in Ukraine, but we started seeing a very big spike in gas prices. That's now obviously been magnified by the war in Ukraine, and that's had an impact throughout the global economy. Gas is definitely, actually we were just at a round table earlier this morning. They're saying it used to be that fossil fuels were not sustainable, but they were reliable. I think the perception is actually fossil fuels are not sustainable, but they're actually not that reliable. I mean, we've had several cases, so it's not just in terms of depending on the Russian gas, but Portugal receiving gas from Nigeria, we ourselves gas from Trinidad and Tobago. There have been cuts in production, so there's been a massive underinvestment in general in energy. And so it's not that reliable, actually, in many cases. Obviously, if you have it, then you can produce with it. But that's all just to say, in terms of the energy mix, we are seeing a spike, obviously, in prices of gas. We've seen a spike in coal production throughout Europe. Honestly, I believe that's a transitory issue, because obviously, if you have less gas, people are having to fire up their coal. We do think that will, or we hope, that will come down. Otherwise, there's no chance of reaching the objectives. Coal is clearly the most pollutant source of production. Germany has recently come out and said they're going to try and finish it by 2030. In general, in Europe, we're not seeing any new production or new coal power plants. So we do believe that coal will be phased out quite quickly over the next couple of years. So we're seeing a spike now in the emissions, but we think that will come back down over the next couple of years.
So amid this energy crisis and let's say the shifting goalposts, if you like, has that affected your goals as a company? Have you had to look again at your plan to go green by 2030? Is it now harder to do that? Are you reassessing?
No, I truly believe that actually we're now in a position where there are even more tailwinds in favor of generating. Again, I've said this, but it sometimes feels like some countries want to use this as an excuse to take one step back. And we should be taking 2 steps forward. Because quite frankly, nowadays, if we can reduce the dependency on fossil fuels, it's better for the environment, it's better for the Paris, meeting the Paris objectives, net zero by 2050, but it is cheaper as well, and it gives you energy independence. And so we stop being so dependent on importing fossil fuels from other countries. So it hasn't changed our goals. If anything, we want to double down, we want to continue investing more. What we do find is that in many countries, we are still not able to invest as much, or in general, we're not investing as much globally as we should be. We should all be investing about 2 or 3 times more than what we are investing in. That's a fact. We know this. Everybody knows that we are underinvesting in renewables. And yet, it's not a lack of capital. It's not a lack of technology. It's really just a question of how you can bring more projects online. So it's a question of implementation. We're now coming up to the COP27. One of the themes of the COP27 is execution. We know what the objectives are. Not 2050, 2030, Europe Fit for 55, the Repower EU, the Inflation Reduction Act in the US. We all know the objectives. It's how do you deploy capital, how do you build the projects fast enough to meet those targets. And that comes down sometimes to very practical things, licensing, permitting, interconnection. These are boring things, but they are absolutely critical if we really want to accelerate the deployment of renewables.
So it's definitely the future, but we're not ready for it now. Is that what you're saying?
No, I'm saying is we can do it, but we need to be going much faster. And we also need to be innovating. So there are certain things technologies that already work, and we need to scale them up. Wind, solar, or wind onshore and offshore, solar, batteries, all of these are technologies that exist. We need to scale them up even faster. And then we need to bring in additional innovation. The International Energy Agency says that if we want to meet the 2050 goals, we need to come up also with new technologies that will complement some of these. So thinking about what additional innovations we can come up with. Will hydrogen be an important vector also in the decarbonization? For sure. So how can we scale that up? Floating solar, floating offshore, how can we scale up those technologies as well? So I think all of these have a lot to do with innovation and a lot to do with being able to ramp up this over time.
And what about storage? Because one of the criticisms sometimes of renewables is that you can generate this energy, but you can't necessarily store it for use later. Is that a key to making this a technology that everyone can use?
So different types of storage. I think in Iberia and in Portugal in particular, for example, we have pump storage, which is the most efficient storage you can have. But even just batteries, lithium, there's an interesting statistics. The area in the energy transition that has most patents at the moment, or that are getting most patents, is the storage area, precisely because there's a lot of companies, a lot of people that are investing time really in investing in storage. So I do believe it is a critical area, and we should, we need to be investing more. Over time, the costs are coming down, the efficiency is improving. All of that, I think, will help storage become more mainstream. In the US, with the support that's being given, storage is already becoming economical, even on a standalone basis. So it's already working together with, for example, solar projects, but now with just on a standalone basis, it's coming on. Europe, not yet, but we think it will over time. So.
And you mentioned incentives to help companies make this transition. How important are they, do you think? How much investment needs to be made?
So I'd separate, investment, we need a lot of investment. I think in terms of incentives, renewables no longer need incentives. They no longer need subsidies. Certainly the mature technologies don't need subsidies. As I say, just to give you an order of magnitude, but to produce a megawatt hour of gas, of electricity using gas nowadays, in many European countries would be maybe 400, 300 euros per megawatt hour. To produce a megawatt hour of electricity with wind or solar would be 40 or 50 euros per megawatt hour. We're talking about an order of magnitude cheaper than in terms of renewables. So we don't need the subsidies. What we need is clear, predictable, stable policies and regulation. Normally when we invest and when people invest in renewables, they want long-term predictability. We just want to make sure that, if we're locking in a renewable project, a wind farm, that we will have visibility over the next 10, 15 years. It can be those 40 or 50 euros per megawatt hour, but it should be locked in for the next 10 or 50 years. What we can't have is changing the rules of the game, unpredictability, changing legislation, changing regulation, which unfortunately is what's happening a lot in Europe at the moment. Precisely when we need most investment, when we need most stability, is when we're also seeing sort of just pretty much, I'll call it maybe a little bit of chaos in terms of regulatory environment.
Well, clearly it is a very volatile situation in the energy world at the moment. Impossible to answer this question. I'm going to ask it anyway. What do you think will happen in the coming winter and also winter next year? What will the picture look like?
In Europe?
In Europe.
I think it looks like we're set for 2022 winter. Storage levels are, at maximums. So if we have a moderate or normal winter, we should be able to get through this winter. Okay, without any significant energy issues in most of Europe. I think the biggest question is 2023, and there's a lot of different research about whether we will then be able to get the storage levels back up for the 2023 winter. Don't forget that Russia's cut off gas to Europe, yet they were supplying us gas throughout most of 2022, so we're able to get those storage levels up. In 2023, we won't be able to count on that. So I think that's the question mark. To be honest, no one has a crystal ball in terms of how we'll be able to do it. But let's say 2022 is not the biggest concern. 23, I think, is where people still have a question mark.